the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery. By the end of the 8th century, Europe seemed to be moving toward a period of relative stability. After centuries marked by the fall of the Roman Empire, invasions by Germanic peoples, and conflicts between small kingdoms, new political structures were beginning to emerge. Christianity was spreading rapidly across the continent. Kings were consolidating their territories, and monasteries were flourishing as centers of faith, knowledge, and culture. While much of Europe believed it was entering a new era of order, far across the North Sea, a people accustomed to icy winds and turbulent waters were preparing to write one of the most remarkable chapters in medieval history. The England of that time was vastly different from the nation we know today. There was no single king ruling the entire island. The territory was divided among several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, competing with one another for power, influence, and land. Historians often refer to this period as the Heptarchy, an era when 7 major kingdoms dominated different regions of England. Northumbria was one of the most powerful. Located in the north of the island, it stretched from the River Humber to the borders of present-day Scotland. For many years, its kings had sponsored the construction of churches, monasteries, and centers of learning that transformed the region into one of Western Europe's major religious hubs. Among all these places, none held as much prestige as a small monastery situated on an island surrounded by the cold waters of the North Sea. Its name was Lindisfarne, founded in the 7th century by the Irish monk Saint Aidan. The monastery quickly became a symbol of the spread of Christianity among the Anglo-Saxon peoples. From there, missionaries set out to convert thousands of people, teach the reading of the scriptures, and preserve important religious manuscripts. Despite its isolation on a small island, Lindisfarne maintained constant contact with other Christian communities. Pilgrims traveled great distances to visit the site, while kings and nobles sent donations of gold, silver, jewels, and land as a sign of their devotion. Over the decades, these donations transformed the monastery into an immensely wealthy institution. Within its walls were kept ornate chalices, gold crosses, reliquaries encrusted with precious stones, hand-illustrated manuscripts, and religious objects crafted by the finest artisans of the era. Each piece represented not only material wealth, but also profound spiritual significance for the Christian community. The monks, however, did not view those treasures as symbols of luxury. To them, each object was a tribute to God. Gold and silver reflected the grandeur of the faith, while manuscripts preserved the sacred word for future generations. Life at Lindisfarne followed an almost unchanging rhythm. Long before sunrise, bells roused the monks for the day's first prayers. Silently, they walked along stone corridors to the main church, where they spent hours chanting and reading the scriptures. After prayers, each monk went about his tasks. Some worked the fields that supplied the community. Others tended to the animals. There were those dedicated to producing beer, bread, and cheese. The most experienced spent their days copying manuscripts and illuminating pages with colored inks and gold leaf, a labor that could take months or even years to complete. It was an environment defined by discipline, simplicity, and contemplation. War seemed like a distant concern. Very few monks knew how to wield a sword. Most had never taken part in a fight. They believed the island's isolation and divine protection would suffice to keep them safe. This confidence was shared by much of Christian Europe. At that time, the greatest dangers stemmed from conflicts between neighboring kingdoms. Attacks usually came by land, carried out by relatively large and easily identifiable armies. No one imagined that the next enemy would emerge from the sea. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers to the north, the reality was vastly different. In the villages scattered across the Scandinavian fjords, local chieftains listened with growing interest to the tales brought back by traders and seafarers. There was talk of monasteries built near the coast, inhabited by unarmed men and filled with precious objects. Such information had been circulating among traders for years. Now, it was beginning to capture the interest of warrior leaders. For many of them, a successful expedition meant enough wealth to strengthen alliances, reward followers, and expand their political influence. Yet attacking an unknown land posed an enormous risk. It required crossing the North Sea, one of Europe's most unpredictable stretches of water. Storms could strike without warning. Treacherous currents swept vessels far from the coast. Giant waves destroyed ill-prepared ships. Even so, some leaders decided to take the risk. The longships, perfected over the preceding decades, would finally be put to the test on a voyage far more ambitious than any undertaken before. Before setting out, the men gathered provisions for a journey lasting several days. Barrels of fresh water were carefully stowed aboard the ships. Dried fish, salted meat, cheese, barley bread, and butter were stored to feed the crew during the crossing. Swords, axes, spears, bows, and shields were arranged along the vessels so they could be quickly reached should any danger arise. At dawn, while mist still clung to parts of the fjords, dozens of men slowly pushed the ships out toward deeper waters. The sails were unfurled. The rowers began to move their long wooden oars in perfect unison. Little by little, the Scandinavian coast vanished into the fog. Ahead lay nothing but the open ocean. For days, they sailed, battling strong winds, bitter cold, and rough seas. Many of those men had never ventured so far from home. Yet the promise of wealth and glory outweighed their fear. Guided by the position of the sun and stars, as well as the accumulated experience of their navigators, they steered southwest. Finally, after a long crossing, the first outlines of the English coast began to appear on the horizon. Dark cliffs emerged through the morning mist. The vegetation looked different from what was found in Scandinavia. Small farming communities could be seen near the coast. The navigators slowed their pace. Now, caution was required. Any mistake could put the entire expedition at risk. As they rounded a stretch of the coast, they spotted a small island. There stood a cluster of stone buildings surrounded by green fields. There were no high walls, no watchtowers. No army could be seen guarding the place. It was exactly as the merchants had described. At that very moment, on the other side of the island, monks were beginning another ordinary day of prayer, completely unaware that unknown vessels were slowly approaching the shore. In a few minutes, the tranquility of Lindisfarne would be shattered forever. The medieval world was about to witness an event that would echo for centuries and officially mark the beginning of the Viking Age. The first light of morning illuminated the calm waters surrounding the small island of Lindisfarne. A gentle wind blew from the North Sea, and the tide slowly rose over the rocks ringing the shore. To the monks, it seemed like just another day. Bells had summoned the community to pre-dawn prayers, and the daily routine unfolded exactly as it had for decades. Some monks walked the stone corridors, reciting psalms in hushed tones. Others were already working in the fields near the monastery, tending the crops that sustained the community. In the scriptorium, scribes carefully copied pages of scripture, dipping quills into dark ink and tracing delicate letters onto parchment. It was work that required silence and patience, and it was deeply respected. A single manuscript could take months, sometimes years, to complete. There was no hint that this place of prayer and learning was about to face the most traumatic moment in its history. Long before any alarm was raised, a monk walking near the shore noticed something unusual on the horizon. Through the morning mist, small, dark silhouettes seemed to emerge from the waves. At first, he assumed they were merchant vessels. Ships frequently visited the English coast, bringing goods and pilgrims from other regions. But there was something different about these vessels. They were moving with unusual speed. Their prows were high and narrow, slicing easily through the water. Long rows of oars moved in perfect unison, propelling the ships forward even when the wind died down. As they drew closer, it became possible to make out men lined up along the decks, protected by round shields fixed to the sides of the vessels. The monk remained motionless for a few moments. I had never seen ships like those before. Meanwhile, aboard the longships, silence reigned among the crew. The warriors watched the coast intently. Many were embarking on their first major expedition beyond Scandinavia. Others had already taken part in smaller voyages across the Baltic Sea and to the northern islands. Now, everyone shared the same goal: to approach the coast without arousing suspicion. The expedition leaders had carefully chosen the moment for landing. The tide favored the ship's approach, and the morning light made it difficult for observers to make out details from a distance. There were no fortresses protecting the island. No military fleet patrolled those waters. It was a virtually defenseless target. As the hulls touched the sandy beach, the rowers raised their oars almost in unison. A brief silence fell over the vessel. Moments later, the first warrior leapt into the shallow water. Dozens of others followed. Each man carried only the essentials for combat. Metal-reinforced wooden shields protected their bodies. One-handed axes hung at their waists. Some wielded long spears. Others carried carefully preserved swords, expensive weapons that symbolized prestige among Norse chieftains. Without wasting a moment, they advanced rapidly toward the monastery. From the top of the hill, a few monks finally realized that these visitors were not merchants. The bells began to ring frantically. The sound echoed across the entire island. The religious men abandoned their tasks and ran toward the church, believing its stone walls might offer protection. Others tried to hide manuscripts, chalices, and sacred relics. Some simply stood frozen, unable to comprehend who those men clad in wool, leather, and heavy cloaks were, as they advanced silently across the damp grass. For the Vikings, everything happened very quickly. They had trained for years to act with speed. Surprise was their greatest advantage. Before any help could arrive from the mainland, the operation would already be complete. The first warriors reached the monastery's outer buildings. Wooden doors were smashed open with heavy axes. Chests were forced open. Silver objects were stuffed into leather sacks. Anything that could be quickly carried away was set aside. Others stormed the main church. The contrast between the two worlds was striking. On one side, monks clad in simple wool habits, men dedicated to prayer, study, and the preservation of knowledge. On the other, warriors hardened by years of training, accustomed to the cold, the sea, and the conflicts between Scandinavian chieftains. There was no possibility of organized resistance. Some of the religious men tried to shield the altar. Others raised crosses and relics, hoping sacred symbols would intimidate the invaders. None of that happened. The Vikings did not share the same faith. To them, those objects were immensely valuable because of the gold, silver, and precious stones they contained. Ornate chalices, intricate crosses, and richly decorated reliquaries represented wealth, not divine protection. While some gathered the treasures, others ransacked the monastery's storerooms. Sacks of grain, barrels of ale, iron tools, fine fabrics. Everything of use was carried off to the ships. In a matter of minutes, the silence that had defined Lindisfarne for decades was replaced by the sound of splintering wood, hurried footsteps, screams of despair, and the clash of metal against stone. Many precious manuscripts fell to the floor amidst the chaos. Many survived simply because they held no immediate value for the invaders. Others were damaged or lost forever. Works patiently copied over the course of years vanished in minutes. To the monks, the destruction seemed impossible to comprehend. How could a place dedicated exclusively to the faith suffer such an attack? Why would God allow pagan men to invade one of his most important sanctuaries? These questions would linger for a long time. Some religious men managed to flee across the nearby fields before the invaders fully arrived. They hid among hills, marshes, and small patches of vegetation, watching from a distance as smoke rose over part of the monastery. It was these very survivors who would later record the events. Chronicles written in the following years describe the attack as a terrible, almost supernatural punishment. Many authors claim that strange signs had appeared in the sky shortly before the invasion. Unusual storms, lightning, flying dragons, and other omens were cited as evidence that God was warning his people of a great tragedy. Although we now know these accounts were influenced by the religious interpretation of the time, they reveal the immense psychological impact caused by the attack. To the Christians of Western Europe, those warriors from the north seemed to emerge from the unknown itself. No one knew exactly who they were. Few knew their origins. Fewer still understood their customs. When the looting ended, the Viking chieftains gave the order to withdraw. Just as they had arrived, they vanished quickly. Sacks laden with silver, gold, and valuables were loaded onto the longships. Rowers took their places, and the vessels once again glided across the waters of the North Sea. The entire operation had taken far less time than any traditional army would have needed to organize a battle. It was precisely this speed that made the Vikings so dangerous. By the time reinforcements could finally reach the monastery, the invaders would already be far from the English coast. Behind them, Lindisfarne remained steeped in silence. Damaged buildings, missing sacred objects, survivors trying to make sense of what had happened. On that day, perhaps none of those involved realized that the attack would go far beyond a mere act of looting. It would officially mark the beginning of a new era, an era in which the sea would cease to be a natural barrier and instead become the primary highway for the warriors of the north. News of the destruction of Lindisfarne would spread rapidly across the monasteries, royal courts, and cities of Europe, and with it, a feeling would spread that was destined to endure for generations. Fear. A fear fueled by the certainty that those men could return at any moment, anywhere the sea touched the land. As the longships slowly vanished over the horizon, silence once again settled over the small island of Lindisfarne. Yet it was no longer the peaceful silence that had accompanied the monks' prayers for decades. Now, it was a heavy silence, broken only by the wind whistling through damaged structures, waves crashing against the rocks, and the few survivors walking amidst the wreckage, trying to comprehend what had occurred. The monastery lay in ruins. Doors had been smashed. Religious artifacts had vanished. Storehouses stood empty. Manuscripts, carefully preserved for years, lay scattered across the floor, many torn, others stained by water or the blood spilled during the attack. The surviving monks immediately began tending to the wounded and gathering the bodies of the fallen. Then, an even more crucial task had to be undertaken. Word had to reach the rest of England. Messengers set out swiftly to inform the bishops and rulers of Northumbria. Along the way, the tale seemed increasingly hard to believe. A band of unknown men had crossed the sea, attacked one of the holiest sites in English Christendom, seized its treasures, and vanished before any army could respond. When the news reached the courts of the Anglo-Saxon kings, it caused astonishment. No ruler had anticipated such a threat. The English kingdoms were accustomed to facing land-based invasions or conflicts with neighbors. Their strongholds and armies were organized with this type of warfare in mind. For a long time, the sea had been viewed as a natural barrier offering protection against invaders. Lindisfarne proved the exact opposite. For the first time, it became evident that the ocean could also serve as a route for an extremely swift and unpredictable enemy. Chroniclers of the time recorded the event in words heavy with dread. One of the best-known accounts describes how heathen men miserably destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. For those religious figures, it was not merely a military attack. It was a spiritual tragedy. For centuries, monasteries had been considered places protected by God. They were spaces dedicated to prayer, study, and the preservation of Christian knowledge. The fact that such an important place had been sacked raised a troubling question among bishops, monks, and kings. Why had God allowed this? Many believed the attack was divine punishment for sins committed by Christians themselves. Sermons began to argue that society had strayed from religious teachings and that the invasion was a call to repentance. This interpretation spread rapidly across Europe. Monasteries in Ireland, France, and other coastal regions began living in a constant state of alert. Although few knew who the invaders were, everyone feared their return, and that fear was not unfounded. Back in Scandinavia, the men who had taken part in the expedition returned home bearing riches far beyond what they had imagined finding. News of the voyage's success spread quickly. Chieftains from other villages heard accounts of a virtually defenseless monastery, teeming with gold, silver, and precious objects. They discovered it was possible to cross the sea, launch a swift attack, and return before any military force could organize a response. This completely changed the rules of the game. Until then, many had viewed long sea voyages as risky adventures. Now, they represented immense opportunities. Before long, new ships began to be built. More men volunteered to join the expeditions. The fame of the leaders who had organized the attack grew considerably. They returned not only with riches, but also with prestige, strengthening alliances and gaining new followers. The news spread through Scandinavian villages just as rapidly as fear was spreading across England. Each side interpreted the events in completely different ways. To the monks, Lindisfarne represented a tragedy. To many Norse chieftains, it represented an opportunity. In the years that followed, other raids began to occur across the British Isles. Small coastal monasteries became frequent targets. The raiders would appear unexpectedly, plunder everything they could carry, and vanish back out to sea. Speed remained their greatest weapon. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms slowly began to adapt their strategies. Some communities started building fortifications near the coast. Watchtowers were erected in certain regions to warn of suspicious vessels. In some places, monks hid their most precious objects in secret locations, hoping to protect them should another attack occur. Yet, these measures remained insufficient. The Vikings continued to choose their targets carefully. They struck where defenses were weakest. They arrived when no one expected them. They departed before reinforcements could arrive. At the same time, their expeditions grew increasingly ambitious. The goal was no longer merely to acquire wealth. Some groups began staying in foreign lands for longer periods. Others spent the winter away from Scandinavia, something previously considered unthinkable. Unknowingly, Europe was entering a new phase of its history. The raid on Lindisfarne was not the greatest clash of the Viking Age. It was not the largest battle. nor was it the biggest raid. Yet, it became the most symbolic of them all. It was the moment when two vastly different worlds collided violently. On one side stood medieval Christendom, convinced that its religious centers were secure. On the other, extraordinary seafarers who had learned to turn the sea into their greatest strategic advantage. From that summer of 793, nothing would ever be the same. For nearly 3 centuries, Viking ships would traverse seas, rivers, and oceans. They would found cities, topple kingdoms, establish trade routes, explore unknown territories, and reach far beyond the limits imagined by the Europeans of the time. The name Viking would come to inspire as much fear as admiration. Stories of warriors from the north would span generations and endure long after the Viking Age itself had ended. But this story was only just beginning. In the years that followed, the attacks would evolve from small coastal raids into major military campaigns. Entire armies would land in the British Isles. Kings would be defeated. New territories would be conquered. And legendary figures would emerge, blending historical fact with legends that would endure for over 1,000 years. The small island of Lindisfarne had been merely the first chapter of a transformation that would forever change the history of Europe.